Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jordan Stark and I'm the Marketing Manager at Canadian Fertility Consulting, and I'm happy to be here with our speakers to discuss updated information on Canada's response to foreign surrogacy immigration during the COVID-19 pandemic. Waiting for a few more attendees to join us. Our speakers are here with us on screen today. We have Leia Swanberg. Leia is the founder and CEO of Canadian Fertility Consulting and Egg Helpers. We have Cindy Wasser of Hope Springs Fertility Law in Toronto, Ontario. And we have a few members of Green and Spiegel LLP, Canada's oldest and largest boutique immigration law practice based in Toronto, Ontario. We have Stephen Green, one of the two senior partners, and he is certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario. We have Alexandra Cole, an associate, and we have Tim Golden, U.S. practice director. Now, before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Number one is that in the event that you have any internet connection issues, please call in using a phone and the number in your webinar registration email so that you can still participate. Item number two is that we would like you to be aware that we are recording this webinar today, and everyone who registered will be sent a direct link to watch this again later, along with the contact information for all of our speakers. It'll also be made available online on CFC's website, YouTube, and Facebook. And last but not least, we are encouraging everyone on this webinar to please ask questions if you have them. We will be doing a live Q&A with all of our speakers at the end, and there is a GoToWebinar questions button that you can use for this. And finally, we would like to remind everyone that this is current information for today, May 28, 2020, and we recommend that you keep informed and updated regularly as things are still changing quite frequently these days. So we have a lot to cover, so let's get started. Our first speaker is Cindy Wasser. After almost 25 years as one of Canada's top criminal defense lawyers, Cindy thought she was retiring in 2008 to become a mother through surrogacy to the first of her two beautifully created daughters. Driven by her difficult journey along the path to parenthood, she instead founded Hope Springs Fertility Law to guide, protect, and advocate for everyone creating families with the help of donors and surrogates. With this unique background, Cindy has grown Hope Springs into the largest fertility law firm in Canada, representing surrogates and hundreds of intended parents from across Canada and around the world. Thanks for joining us, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Jordan. It's good to be back. I think the most significant thing you've said was how this is current up to today, because in fact the situation is so fluid, and I'm sure everyone has heard that term over and over again, but it is so very true with respect to the Canadian immigration issue and surrogacy. And so we decided to come back as a team and do part two and give you an update, and maybe we'll keep doing it like a really good Netflix series. So today I just want to do a quick update on the surrogacy legal aspects. And I want to say that we've probably let in or received applications successfully for about 60 families since the travel ban issued to be here for the birth of their surrogate babies. No one to date has been refused entry. Everyone's been able to be here for the birth, and people have experienced a pretty decent entry process. Stephen and his team will talk about the details of that. I also want to talk about, after the baby's born, being able to get back home for those international families. The Passport Canada issue has been phenomenal, I have to say. What we do now is, as soon as the registrar here in Ontario lets me know that she has in fact registered the birth, the next step will be for her to print birth certificates and send them by overnight courier to us for our clients. So we have about a day and a half of time wait. So I immediately email a specific address for emergency passports. And within that day, usually I get a phone call from an employee of Passport Canada identifying himself or herself with a cell phone number, which I am to give to my clients. So international folks, you need to have a local phone number for your cell phone, please. And you need to keep it with you at all times. These people are very busy. When they call you or you call them, and they call you back, you need to answer. You will be, once you connected, asked where you are, what passport office you want to go to. Now, many of them have shut. So, for example, if you're in the Greater Toronto area, you may be asked to drive to the passport office near the airport in Mississauga. If you're somewhere in near the city like London, Ontario, you'll go to the office in London, Ontario. So the smaller center like St. Thomas might be closed. Ottawa has a passport office, so all the major cities. You're given a specific appointment time. You arrive with your baby, your birth certificate, your passport application, and we fill that out for you if you're our client, and your itinerary for your return flight home. You must remember to add the baby onto the flight home and show that it's on the itinerary, which you should have printed as a hard copy. The photos of the baby, of course, and then you knock on the door of the passport office a few minutes before your appointment. Please wear masks, please bring gloves, and advise that you are there for the passport appointment with the named individual. You will be led inside, they will review your paperwork, and then they will tell you when to come back to pick up the passport. That date or time will be determined by your flight home. So if your flight is tomorrow, you will be told to come back in a few hours. If your flight is a week later, they might ask you to come back a day or two later. And the passports are being issued without problems, and everyone has been able to make their flight home. So that's a big update for me. The other thing I wanted to talk about the application process that Alexandra and Stephen will go into detail about, is that one of the reasons you will have that letter for is not just to gain entry, but because you need health insurance while you're in Canada and insurance for the baby, which must cover the possibility of contracting COVID as well. The letter from Immigration Canada authorizing your entry will be used by Allianz Insurance to cover you in the event of COVID as well. So it's very important to have it. And US citizens who are not subject to the travel ban and those who already have Canadian-born babies who are not subject to the travel ban are gaining entry under different conditions. So it's probably a very good idea for everyone to apply for the authorization letter anyway, and then receive a note saying you don't need it, but that note may be used for the purpose of health insurance. And we're going to actually make a specific inquiry about that. So if you're one of those people, please make sure you reach out to your lawyer in the next little while for an update to see if you actually need that or not. And when we get the answer from Allianz, I know I'll be posting it, Leia. I have no doubt you will as well. So we'll make sure that that gets out to everybody and all the lawyers as well. I think that's it for me right now. I might come back in to address a few issues as we progress. So thanks so much. And I'll take it now to Stephen.
Thank you, Cindy. We have Stephen Green and Alexandra Cole here with us from Green and Spiegel. As I mentioned earlier, Green and Spiegel is Canada's oldest and largest boutique immigration law practice for over 50 years. They have been assisting a diverse global clientele of families and businesses to help navigate Canadian immigration law. Based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, they also have offices in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Providence, Rhode Island, Vail, Colorado, and Cleveland, Ohio. So Stephen Green, he is one of the two senior partners and is certified as a specialist in immigration law by the Law Society of Ontario. Stephen has been practicing immigration law for 30 years and has extensive experience in all areas of Canadian immigration. Stephen has been identified for many years as the leading practitioner in immigration law. Stephen is considered a subject matter expert in the field, frequently asked to speak as a panelist, moderator, and lecturer. Alexandra Cole is an associate at Green & Spiegel LLP, and Alexandra practices in all areas of Canadian immigration and citizenship law, including work, student, and visitor visas and permits, immigration and refugee boarding hearings, federal court litigation, permanent residency, admissibility and enforcement matters, investigations, humanitarian and compassionate application. She values client relationships and places importance on detailed and vigorous client representation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you very much, Jordan. To begin with, it's important to re-emphasize what Cindy has indicated, that the information we're giving you today is current today. The COVID situation is extremely fluid. Things are changing constantly. And in Canada, our Prime Minister, our premiers for each province are on TV every day, changing little things to make sure that the public in Canada is safe. So it's important to always check with respect to the current law. And that law, as it stands today, is that people are not permitted to come into Canada unless they can establish that they fall within one of the exceptions. And the cornerstone of the Canadian immigration policy is family reunification and family. And the government of Canada, when they announced the travel ban to protect the public, understood how important family is from within Canada and family from outside. So they have made an exception for immediate family members to come into Canada, and that's where the surrogate families fall into. And as Cindy indicated, the families that Alex and myself and Cindy and really the whole team of people here today talking to you have been 100% successful so far. And that's because we understand the fluid situation and how things are constantly changing. And it's important to understand that the final decision with respect to people coming into Canada is kind of a team effort with various departments in Canada. We have the Immigration Department that has set the policy, and Alex will talk about the special authorization or letter that we acquire from immigration that says that you, as someone living abroad coming here for the birth of your child, it is an important cornerstone for immediate family reunification. And then we have the border officers that want to examine to make sure that you have the proper documentation. And also the airlines. It's quite interesting that Canada has given authority to the airlines to determine if you coming into Canada fall into that special exception with respect to family reunification. And it's the airline that contacts really the border people before you get on the aircraft to come to Canada to say, hey, they've got this special letter. We understand family reunification is important. Will you confirm with us as an airline that you will allow this person to board the aircraft? So as you can see, it's a big team effort of various departments in the immigration, in the public protection area that is involved in making the decision. Once you have been granted this special authority to come into Canada and you arrive in Canada, then of course, currently Canada has quarantine laws and you must quarantine for 14 days. And Alex will talk about a quarantine plan that you should be aware of and be able to present at the border. And the government has also stated that you must be wearing a mask when you enter Canada, and you are questioned by the border officers to make sure that everything is in order. So I guess my message to you today is that Canada is very open to this whole process. The cornerstone of our immigration policy is family reunification, and family really is a very important part of the Canadian society and how we want to help families be united. And that's why this special exemption exists for people involved in surrogate birth. So I will be quiet now and I'll let Alex go through the process and some examples how she has helped so many families get the proper documentation and be in a position to answer the questions that border officers, airlines will have when you are attempting to enter Canada.
Thank you, Stephen. As both Stephen and Cindy alluded to, there are different kind of groups of people, and there may be a different process for you depending upon which group that you fit into. So there are two sets of rules, one which applies to travel from the United States into Canada, and one which applies to people who are traveling from countries other than the United States. So for the people traveling from countries other than the United States, so really anywhere else in the world, you do need a travel authorization letter from the government. And this is kind of the primary thing that we've been helping people with, because it's the most common scenario, is people traveling from really any part of the world to be here for the birth of their child. The government has recognized that family reunification and being able to be here in Canada for the birth of your Canadian child is a purpose of travel that is essential, and that they are going to consider and give you special authorization to board that flight and to enter Canada. So that is something you do need to do unless you have a Canadian family member who is a child or a spouse already. So if you are in a relationship, your partner is a Canadian and you are a non-Canadian or a non-permanent resident, you need to show the airline that you are an immediate family member of a Canadian. You're not going to be applying to the government for a special authorization, but you are going to need to show to the airline and to the border official that you are an immediate family member of a Canadian citizen, as well as show them that you are coming to Canada for the birth of your child. So that is the two scenarios for people outside of the United States. If you're coming to Canada from the United States, whether you're coming by airplane or whether you're planning to request entry to Canada at the border, so the land border between the United States and Canada, you also will not be granted any special authorization from the government of Canada. You will need to demonstrate to the border official, or at the time of trying to board your flight to Canada, that you have an essential purpose to come to Canada. And what essential means is that it's not at your discretion. You actually do need to be coming to Canada for something very important, for something non-discretionary. And what we've found, and as Cindy mentioned, we've had no issues with people being able to enter the country. But what we found is that the border officials do want to see proof of why you're coming. That can include something like the surrogacy agreement, along with other documentation depending upon your situation. They want to know where you're going. Do you have a quarantine plan? And the quarantine plan applies to anyone coming to the country, whether you're coming from Europe, Asia, from US. You need to have a plan in place that says, I have booked a hotel for 14 days. I have booked an Airbnb for 14 days. My Airbnb host or my family member in Canada or my surrogate's family member has stocked my place with groceries. They want to see that you have made a plan and that you're taking the quarantine requirements seriously, because when you arrive in Canada, it is mandatory for you to self-isolate for 14 days. And you do need to have proof of that. As Stephen mentioned, you should be traveling with a mask. That mask should be on your face when you're speaking with border officials and when you're crossing through the border. Stephen, I'm not sure if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Well, I guess, Alex, it's so important that we express to everyone out there that unlike so many other countries of the world, Canada is really, really, and I'm emphasizing really, facilitative with respect to surrogate situations. They understand it, and I don't think there's a country in the world that is open to the process and really helping families from all over the world grow their own family. So that would really be my last comment with respect to the system.
I think, yeah, and on that point, I think it's important to also mention that not only has the government allowed the immediate parents, so the intended parents of the surrogate child, to be authorized to travel to Canada, but we've also had success in situations where, as an intended parent, you may already have a child or several children of your own that you've either adopted, a previous surrogate, or your own biological child. And the government has also authorized people to travel to Canada with their child. If you can show that you are the legal parent of that child, and when you're making that request to the government, whether it be for the special authorization or whether it be at the land border or the airport, they have authorized entry so that the family can stay together as a family unit for this really important occasion in Canada.
And the quarantine that you talk about, the government takes it very serious in Canada, and many of our clients receive telephone calls 2 to 3 days after they have arrived, because everyone who enters Canada must fill out a form which will advise the border officer where you're quarantined, how you can be reached, and the government of Canada follows it up very closely. So again, protecting the public is the prime objective here.
And then as a final note,
because I feel the need to also thank our country for what it's done. In part one, we talked about how this process began, and I just want to say that, in 9 days of being alerted to the issue when the travel ban came down, our government came together in Parliament. It was nonpartisan. All the parties, all the members of Parliament, the orders in council were passed in the midst of one of the greatest emergencies our country has seen, with thousands of other issues to deal with. Our government came together to say babies first. And as Stephen said, no other country has done that. It is absolutely imperative that everyone show their respect to our government authorities, to all those frontline workers at the border, the airline staff, everybody, with those precautions that Stephen and Alex said, because each one of you entering this country as a special guest is also an ambassador for the future of surrogacy and all the other parents who are coming in the future. No other country has said in such a manner that we believe in surrogacy, and so it is absolutely crucial that we show them the respect that's deserved so that the international surrogacy process will continue in the future. That's my bit.
thank you. So I believe Tim, our U.S. practice director, will be speaking about some U.S. considerations.
Oh, thank you, Alex. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the detailed explanation as well, which unfortunately, as we turn to the U.S., we don't have that level of sort of specificity when it comes to entries into the United States for this. And unfortunately, it's been the sort of start from the start of this, no guidance is the discussion. And the only guidance really comes under the pressure from the agreement with Canada. So entries into the United States are still under this has been already identified, essential, non-essential standard. And I think obviously that's critical for both the biological mothers who are entering potentially into the United States. I just had a discussion recently, just today, with an individual entering in for that purpose, as well as the surrogate parents potentially having to go into the United States for the birth of the child, for even, ultimately maybe potentially really sort of pushing the boundaries potentially, but even attending those appointments, et cetera, with the biological mother. Nonetheless, the real framework has to be identified, which is at physical border entry into the United States versus airlines. I mean, I think that's really the distinction here that, particularly for these situations, has to be presented and has to be identified. And in each instance, also those factors that have to be really focused on. At the physical border, that essentiality is the identifying factor that potentially could really push the boundaries. So for driving into the United States, presenting, it's taken from the standpoint of the supply chain and the essentiality. Flying into the United States from the designated airports within Canada that permit those flights into the United States, there isn't that standard. So in that reflection of just that point, ultimately you can sort of carve out the statutory approach. It wasn't in the agreement with Canada about flying into the United States, but at the same time, you then have to apply a practical standard, which is that you should be still identifying what are the essential things about this visit today that I can present to really identify and sort of push that individual at the airport to allow entry. Because as said, statutorily not applicable, but in a practical sense, you're presenting to that officer, and that officer can really sort of push back in terms of why do you need to go into the United States at that point. So in either instance, you want to be really guarded against any of those but potential presentation of those issues. And I think, sort of going down that listing that is built off of Alex and Stevens' presentation is that you want to identify what is the essential nature of that entry. Is it for fertility treatments in the United States? Is it potentially for the surrogate parents to attend the birth of their child? All of those things need to be really documented ahead of time through identification from a doctor's letter, from the U.S. entity that, where the fertility is going to take place, the U.S. hospital where the birthing is going to take place, et cetera. All of that really has to be presented and ready for presentation to that officer. On top of that, you're then going through the laundry list of sort of the regular documents that would show, okay, is there any sort of other standard, which as a visitor, you're always making a promise that you're going to be coming back to Canada. You'd want to be able to square that off as well with that officer to be able to present, here's evidence of my establishment here, here's my employment. And then also, talking about the anchors that sort of bring you back to Canada in relation to this surrogacy. And those are then lined up. And then what we really expose in sort of the final piece that you always want to be able to present going into the United States is identification of where are you headed? And that's a sort of twofold. One is they want to be able to, even though, there aren't the sort of parallel articulated statutes and regulations from Canada, obviously those US officers, and this is a big distinction, as we've seen in the headlines, most of the state-based restrictions are obviously run by the state. US immigration is a federal standard. But in order to make sure that that US official who is only overseeing US immigration admits you properly, then they may have this question of, I see you're headed to California, I see you're headed to Utah, I see you're headed to Texas. Give me information and give me confirmation that you're going to be able to isolate should there be any sort of issue, that you have health insurance that's going to cover anything that may be any charges or fees that may be applicable, and that there really has been, I think, a contemplation about the regulations particular to that state. And with that, you have a three-part test, or rather sort of a three-part checklist to say, I've identified what the essential nature is. I've identified that I am a Canadian resident, I'm going to be coming back. And then finally, I really squared away and identified what it is that that local state is going to require me to do. So that officer, again, not under regulations at the airport applying that essentiality, now is at a much more comfortable level to say, okay, understood with the sort of general environment here, I'm going to allow this individual to go in to the United States and conduct what really can be sort of identified as essential aspects. And one of the key pieces on this, I think, is really, or so the immediate question is, well, what happens if they don't allow me in? What are the ramifications of that? And I think, again, there's sort of a three-tiered test there. The sort of low response, particularly against the benefit you're having coming in from an airport, pre-flight inspection through these Canadian airports that do pre-flight inspection on the Canadian side, is that you're on Canadian soil. So if there is some sort of confrontation, it's a much easier ability to sort of turn around, withdraw the application, which is the sort of default conclusion from any officer who denies entry into the United States. It is officially a withdrawal. There's a cordial conversation. I can't let you in today because we can't identify, sort of the standards that we're looking for to allow you entry on this day. But that's a withdrawal, and that is not, some ultimate black mark that's on an immigration record. The sort of next tier is that there actually can be officially recorded a denial of entry, but again, no significant ramifications, always something that you want to disclose if ever asked in any other sort of capacity, a future entry into the United States, have you ever been denied? You can talk about it, but you can also talk about sort of the natural circumstances, which is that officer didn't cite a legitimate reason for entry on that day, and sort of talk about the background of it, talk about the circumstances of the environment, the COVID pandemic environment that's applicable. And then the third, which really is the one that we have to avoid and have to discuss, is some situation, and this would be where false statements are made or presentation of false materials, any sort of false justification, but I think also just generally a sort of cantankerous, confrontational circumstance with an officer. Unfortunately, because their discretion is so significant that they can really sort of run you through the ringer. And then you start to talk about if there is a removal, which that's in big, bold letters, removal, that's a situation where false statements were made, and now you may be barred for entry to the United States for 5 years and for a lifetime if it involves false statements to a U.S. government official. So those, I think those are the things that you've got to keep in mind. But at the same time, I think appreciate that there is not a standard by which, if I'm not allowed into the United States, somehow my future is really compromised in the U.S. as long as it doesn't sort of reach that third level of a removal order. So I think that's a key piece. And then talking about, also the sort of footnotes, I think, in this discussion with those border officials. What are the other aspects that you can really talk about in terms of sort of that front end piece, which I was talking about, which is the justification for why you need to go in? And I think sort of the ornaments on that, or the additions, is always to sort of talk about what are the practical aspects of this. And, in discussions, particularly presented for, for fertility treatments, if you can identify some specific aspect or some specific approach that's seen success in the United States that's not available in Canada, that is really one of the strongest positions to take. And then I think even on top of that is, I think in counter, you always sort of think of the flippant officer, say, well, why didn't you do this in Canada? Say, well, I've already started on this program. And that, I think, is really one of the more important things, I think, specific to this situation, is the proximity. This is not it's not a situation where we can delay entry and just sort of pick up. The timing is obviously crucial for any pregnancy, for the application of these fertility treatments, et cetera. So those are the type of things, again, that stack of documents sort of divided into those three parts is really important to be able to present. And, I think in reflection of, again, that sort of statutory requirement of there is no standard at the airports, but there is the physical border. If it's an impossibility, if it's only an option to drive across the border, I think in reality, how we've structured this and how you present it, it really would likely be able to sort of meet the standards at a physical entry, at a physical port of entry, to be able to go in under that essentiality. And, in reality, that, again, because of the fact that there really has been no guidance, my discussions with the physical border throughout this, there really has been sort of a growing acceptance, which is that, different borders, different ports of entry are really sort of applying their own standards. And, around the GTA, there are others, across the US-Canadian border, there are ones that really, in approach, ability to sort of discuss with them in advance, particularly if they have sort of specific staff that processes a certain application similar to this, talking with them and really in advance getting some sort of understanding in advance of what they're accepting, what they potentially could. And that's where you can really establish a good relationship with a particular port of entry. And again, that sort of is the second tier or the second option if flying out of a pre-flight inspection airport out of Canada is not an option. If your hand is forced and you have to adhere to that essential standard that's applicable to physical border, that's when you really want to have sort of a strategy in terms of where you're crossing, making sure that you have as much information and much sort of preliminary discussions with them about presenting this potentiality. So, I mean, I think that really sort of covers it in terms of those physical entries into the United States. I know also that there was obviously a discussion of sort of the consular process, which, we've recommended these webcasts previously, is if there is a claim to U.S. citizenship for the child through a biological parentage, that through the consulates, that's an opportunity where if a child is born here in Canada to U.S. citizen parents and intend to return to the U.S., then officially speaking, they are obligated, because it was a foreign birth, to register the birth with the consulate abroad and at the same time apply for a passport. That is, based on a couple of different factors. If it's a single parent, that parent must have resided for 5 years, 2 of which are after the age of 14. But that's the process by which, sort of on the other side, that the child's not being born in the United States, but rather here in Canada, and how to get that U.S. citizenship, it would be through the consulate. An update on the consulates during the COVID crisis: unfortunately, they still are under lockdown. It is only for U.S. citizens with life or death circumstances to get U.S. passport, et cetera. So I would say that a registry of birth abroad is not necessarily a life or death situation, and that is being applied to not only the consulates but all the passport offices across the U.S. But that is hopefully going to be lifted universally this month. With the consulates, we're not sure. So, I mean, that's the current update from the consulates. But I think that's I know I've taken a lot of time, but is there other issues, Jordan, that you wanted to address from the listing?
Thanks so much, Tim. We're just going to have Leia on next. We do have some questions here for everyone that we'll address shortly after that, if that sounds good. We'll introduce Leia now, and Tim will get you, as well as Stephen and Alexandra, to hop on afterwards. Thank you so much. Thank you, Leia. Thanks for joining us. Leia is a mother to 5 and 2-time gestational surrogate and a 6-time egg donor. She began Canadian Fertility Consulting and Egg Helpers in 2007 after her second surrogacy, with the intention of creating a more rewarding surrogacy and donation experience for intended parents, surrogates, and donors. With a background in business development and management, Leia turned her personal passion for alternative family into a full-time business.
Thank you for the intro, Jordan. It's great to be doing this update today. As everyone has said, this process, is evolving really daily as we get updates on COVID-19, as we get updates on the rest of the world's response, as well as Canada's response to this pandemic. I want to thank everyone on this webinar who has been creating these processes for our clients as well as clients of other agencies. It's absolutely been amazing to watch how seamlessly people have been able to enter Canada for the birth of their child or children. I want to just take a moment to address some of the pieces that people have spoken about, and I want to do so. I know there's a number of surrogates who are watching this, so I want to address the surrogates rather than the intended parents who are traveling in. If you're a surrogate listening, you've likely been asked by your agency to either complete some documents or have some documents provided by your midwife or care provider. And I really want to reassure you that those documents or the information that we're asking you for is to ensure that your intended parents are able to enter the country easily. We want to ensure that as they arrive to the border, they have all of the documentation that the lawyers had previously spoken about. And so we really appreciate your continued commitment to supporting your intended parents and taking care of all of that documentation. I know sometimes it can be a hassle, but we really, really appreciate it. I also wanted to mention to surrogates that this is in hand. So the lawyers that have spoken earlier, they have everyone's best interest at heart. And for me, my main concern always is, or two main concerns in these situations are that first and foremost, your intended parents are here, that they've had sufficient time to self-isolate or self-quarantine for those 14 days. And so we're going to recommend that your intended parents arrive by the end of the 34th week, so that going into the 37th week, they are ready to be present with you if the hospital allows, and they're able to be a part of the birth and receive their child, immediately upon birth. And so we are working diligently. We are working with intended parents. We are helping them make travel arrangements, and we are helping them with this legal piece. Secondly, and this is really important for you to know, your mental health matters. The anxiety you may have of being unsure if your intended parents can arrive and what that's going to look like for them. I want you to know that the entire surrogacy community is dedicated to ensuring that you as a surrogate are not put in or placed in a position to care for a child that isn't your own. And listen, I know all of you would, and if that case occurs, we are so grateful that you're able to do that. But we just want you to know that this process that your intended parents are going through really is a paperwork process. It does not show any lack of commitment if it takes longer or it's more difficult for them. The lawyers are working with them, and each country that they are traveling from, may have policies as well about allowing them to leave that country, aside from us allowing them to enter this country. And so just know we absolutely have your intended parents' best interests at heart, and yours, as does every agency. So please, if you're a surrogate and you're just feeling a little unsure about this process, please speak to your agency, speak to the lawyer that reviewed your legal agreement with you. They all, sort of are up to speed on what's been going on, so that you can easily be reassured that we are all working to have your intended parents here in time. I also wanted to address quickly what Tim was speaking about in terms of traveling to the US. I know that many of you on this webinar are either surrogates or intended parents who are waiting for treatment to begin. These last few months have been very difficult in terms of being at a standstill and waiting for fertility treatments to resume, as initially they were not thought to be an essential service. I know, and you know, that waiting for fertility treatments is so hard, and every day feels like a month. And so clinics in the US now are open. Clinics across Canada are now open. So if you are traveling, if you are a surrogate or intended parent working with a US clinic, and you are waiting for treatment to resume, or with the borders being closed, you just aren't sure, what that's going to look like for you in the coming months, listen to this last piece of the webinar where Tim was speaking about that. Reach out to Tim. His details will be coming in an email, and having a conversation, and really gaining clarity on where your surrogate is traveling for treatment, where you are traveling for treatment if you are still coming from abroad to the US or to Canada, is really important. And so I know many of you are sort of waiting for that, and I imagine that some of the questions will reflect that. But please know that clinics are open. We are working around getting people into the US for treatment. Surrogates, intended parents who are traveling within Canada, or intended parents who are traveling from outside of Canada for treatment. So intended mothers who are using their own genetic material and sort of going through an egg retrieval process. Same-sex male couples who are required to leave sperm samples so that they can access treatment. I'm really hoping that Alexandra or Cindy or Stephen, that one of you can answer if people coming to Canada for fertility treatment. I've been texted this question and WhatsApp this question probably 10 times in the last few minutes, if that's going to be a thing. So I don't know, Jordan, if we can just roll into questions and we can all come back on screen. And if we could just answer that first question first. Can people come to Canada to start fertility treatment? Is fertility treatment deemed essential by the Canadian government? And then second would be, Tim, if you could answer about traveling into the US, if you have any tips for clients, because that again is a big question that I've been sent.
That's a great question. I would say if we can demonstrate that it is sort of essential medical treatment, then I think we would be okay. Once all these clinics are opening, and I understand, you know, private clinics are now just starting to open. So I think that's kind of a fluid question. I would say, you know, maybe national interest, helping people. So I think we have a pretty good chance of it. But again, I think we have to wait another week or so to see what opens, how it opens, and what are the criteria with respect to the services that people are, as doctors or fertility clinics, allowed to offer. And they're just opening up like in the next week or so.
Okay, so if a client was interested in traveling to Canada for treatment in order to continue their IVF cycle and the surrogate is ready, would they contact your office to have a travel authorization letter, and we'd get a letter from the fertility clinic, and we could put that together for people? And yes, I'm putting you on the spot right now.
I would say yes to all, because you would, I mean, if the people were from outside of the United States, they wouldn't be able to board an airplane because they would just be a visitor. So we have to get that special authorization to come. And then again, at the border, if they're driving in from the United States, you would have to have enough documentation to show that it's considered, you know, non-discretionary entry.
And people from abroad, so people from France, Spain, Italy.
They would need the special authorization to board the aircraft.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Ask a question leading from that and what Tim spoke about earlier. For the surrogate who needs to go to the United States for fertility treatment, the clinic needs to write a letter saying that it is essential treatment and that it is a time-sensitive treatment. There are two factors. Tim, do you see any reason why any U.S. clinic couldn't write that letter for surrogates? And then the offshoot would be, Stephen, couldn't a Canadian clinic be able to say the same thing for those international parents needing to come to Canada for treatment? Is there a difference?
So, I mean, if you're asking about the US, I mean, I think it's sort of piggybacks on what I was saying before, that you have this sort of three-part test. Here's the essentiality. Here are all the details of what this treatment is required. One thing that I didn't miss is always you want to be able to flavor it with, this is important to the US economy. This is a US company that is earning money based on this. So, I mean, again, we're moving back to, there are no rules when you're flying into the United States. You're meeting an essentiality. You're pushing that issue, but to be able to identify, and I would just warn about this, and I think it's always in your back pocket. It's sort of that ultimate reflection, but you know, it is the idea that you go through all of the discussion we just talked about previously. I'm coming back to Canada. I've got all these essential issues, and here's my whole quarantine. This is what I do. This is the state base that I adhere to. But you know, then that officer at Pearson says, "Well, I don't like it." The sort of, you know, ultimate sort of counter is to say, well, as I understand, there is an essential nature. I'm permitted to enter into the United States. You know, that does really poke the bear, but at the same time, I think it's important for, you know, to have everything at your disposal to really be able to push that. But, you know, I would say the timing, as you said, and then, you know, the importance to the U.S. economy and importance to the, you know, process itself. I think is really.
I think the same would apply in Canada, except for the economic situation that is not something that they look at all. And again, if you are coming, you would definitely have to quarantine. So timing is very important. So you have to come, quarantine 2 weeks, and then be permitted.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for the U.S. as well, even though it's not enforced as much in Canada, to be able to say, I got to be there 2 weeks in advance because I've got to, reside outside, or that's a requirement. That's something that, the clinic can piggyback on, and we've done that as well, which is the clinic is able to identify state regulations even within their statement. And then, that's really sort of protected overall from 2 points, showing what they're going to do, and then also this identification by the fertility clinic to say, we've got certain regulations. They've got to be here 2 weeks in advance to sort of prep for it.
Excellent. Thank
So
you. Jordan, do you want to go ahead? Oh, sorry.
Sorry, what I'm hearing, I think, is that if any American clinic staff are listening, or doctors, they really don't need to be concerned about writing that essential treatment letter for the surrogate coming in at the very least, and that surrogates could really do well with having a quick briefing from someone like Tim, for example, about what to expect if they're willing to go over the border, and to be ready to answer those questions for their plan. And that seems like a really great idea to offer support to surrogates.
Always available.
Sorry to put you on the spot, but
Great. We have
Jordan,
a
do you want to go on with the other questions?
Yes, we have a viewer who's wondering if any of you have any knowledge of any Canadian surrogate of having already traveled to the US for a transfer under the current situation, and how that worked.
I understand at this point that surrogates have not traveled. The clinics have recently opened up in the US, and I know that there are surrogates who are preparing for the embryo transfers, and so I would imagine in the next few weeks we will have further information about what that looked like in terms of travel for the surrogate.
Wonderful. The next question here, they are saying that their return flights were canceled and they can't currently book new ones until closer to the birth date, which is the end of June or start of July. They want to know, do they have to have them booked in order to do the passport?
to leave Canada to get the passport, do they need a flight for the baby?
Correct.
So, legally, no, but you have to leave the country. So there needs to be a flight plan at the very least. The timing of getting the passport depends on the flight. So if you say the flight is to be determined, you're not going to get the passport urgently. You're here anyway, so you don't need to have the urgent passport appointment. But if you say, the next flight is in 3 weeks, then book that flight and take that to the passport office so you get it done in the meantime. Does that answer the question you have, Jordan?
I believe so. We'll see if they send anything else in. The next question we can move on to. These IPs have come to Canada. Sorry, they have to come to Canada at the end of June for the birth of their baby in July. That will be in Edmonton, Alberta. However, their plane has stops in Montreal and Toronto along the way. How can they be sure that the authorities will let them self-quarantine in Edmonton and not before in either Toronto or Montreal?
Alex, you can confirm for me, we're not aware of anybody who hasn't been allowed to go to the final destination for their quarantine.
Correct, yeah. As long as when you're, transiting through whatever your first point of entry is, make sure you're abiding by the, the rules in place, wear your mask, etc. And then when you arrive at your final destination, that's where you will be allowed to quarantine. We haven't had any issues.
Right. And also, make sure that there is enough transit time for you to get your domestic flight. Because remember that when you come internationally into Montreal, you do see the border officer, you have to satisfy them of everything, and then you have to catch the domestic flight. A lot of flights are delayed internationally, so just bear that in mind when you're booking your connecting flight.
Yeah, and if you're traveling with a child or children, As my experience has been, you need a lot of time to get through that airport.
Great, thank you both. The next question we have, is it possible for hopeful parents to work with their local clinics outside of Canada to collect their sperm/egg donations and have them sent to a fertility clinic in Canada currently?
So Leah and I, we did a webinar earlier this week with the Create Fertility Center, and that's recorded. And so I guess, Leah, you've got it on some of your sites. I think I have it on mine too, where Dr. Liebrack announced, and I believe it was Monday, that he has been developing a sperm kit so that it'll soon, hopefully this is going to work, where he can send it internationally. Donors can send their sperm sample back.
Okay.
And so while that addresses sperm for intended moms who are wanting to, or who will be using their own eggs, you know, they can, it sounds like they will be able to travel to Canada now with this type of letter that Stephen and Alexandra could provide them. But we can also connect them with the clinic literally anywhere in the world. If they are wanting to create their embryos closer to home, we can help support them with that and getting their embryos here to Canada or even into the US.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question that was just sent in by email. They are wondering, what are the factors that would cause more conservative adjustments in Canada's policy regarding American visitors who have a newborn in Canada? Is it a function of the prevalence of COVID in the US and Canada, or is it a function of the reciprocal policy in the United States, changes in American policy with regards to Canada? What are the factors that would cause more permissive adjustments?
I mean,
That's a great question.
I think all of the above. You know, over and over again, our medical officer of health for Canada has stated that it's a fluid situation. We're looking at everything. We're looking at the source country where people come from. We're looking at what's the situation in Canada. So it really is a matter, you know, for everything, and it changes constantly. So it's kind of hard to give you any prediction in that sense. I guess the only thing I could really say is that as you know, the numbers go down, things get better, then things will start to open up, and that's been, you know, our experience in the past. And you could look at other countries as an example of that.
I think politically, you know, it's important to know that Canada has a very rational approach to these things, and the Canadian politicians are working with the American counterparts and of course other countries as well. But in terms of the Canada-US border, watching and working with the medical health professionals and deciding what is the safest practice to protect Canadians.
Okay, great. I think that's all the time we have today, but I would like to let everyone know that we will be sending this by email along with contact information for all of our speakers today. And thank you to all of our speakers who took the time to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jordan, great to
Be safe, everyone.
Yep, you too. Bye.
Bye.